So today I'm just going to give you a very brief overview. I'll point you to where there are a lot more resources available for you as well, which will, I guess a lot of today it's about helping you make decisions of how do you best start preparing for this, because this has landed now. It might all seem pretty scary. There's a lot of new documents out there, there's a lot of new material, there's some revamped material. Where should you start in terms of working out what is best for you? So first of all, myself, why am I so interested in temporary traffic management? How did I end up in this role? Straight out of university, my first job was a small engineering consultancy, traffic engineering, and very early on, some of the projects that I got involved in were major design and construct road projects. I was based in Perth, and these were projects where the contractor got me as a traffic engineer, got the traffic management companies, got them all involved right up at the tender stage of the project to say, this is what we're thinking, what are the traffic management implications? So I was developing traffic management plans right from the start, working with them in developing the best construction methodology to provide an overview of what was the best way for them to construct the job, the cheapest way, what impacts were there on traffic management, and where were the safety risks that arose from that. So I was doing that for quite a number of years. I then joined Main Roads in Western Australia. And when in that role, I was responsible for all traffic engineering standards, including the standard for roadworks. And it was during that time, Australian standards were updating the standard for traffic control at roadworks, 1742 Part 3. You'll all be familiar with that document. So the 2002 edition, I was closely involved with drafting that standard. And immediately following that, I helped implement it through Western Australia. Subsequent to that, I left Australia, moved to the UK, joined a very large consultancy, about 24,000 people across England alone. We were a contractor, consultant, doing major maintenance works, major construction works, and again, I was heavily involved with companies in developing up traffic management planning, planning out jobs. We had contracts that went for 20 years. And we had to work out the best balance between construction, maintenance activities, traffic management, the whole lot for the duration of the contract. The UK is interesting because they always sort of held up as sort of like one of the pinnacles of safety in design and safety and work health place and safety. So on the one hand, if you drive around the UK, and I spent 4 years living there, I've just recently returned from a holiday there as well, you will not see a traffic controller with a stop-slow bat. They do not exist. You will not see someone standing in front of traffic with a bat trying to control traffic by themselves. Traffic signals everywhere, or alternatively signage. So the UK made that decision decades ago that they're not going to have human beings standing in front of traffic because of the risks involved. So that's an area where Australia is still grappling with that, and that's a hot topic right now. On the other hand, one of the projects that I was involved with Highways Agency was looking at practices for installing signage on wide motorways. Now these are motorways 4 lanes or more wide. They don't allow vehicles to stop in the fast lane or the median to put signs out on the median. Their requirement was you stop on the left-hand side, over on the verge. You pull the sign off the truck, you put it together, and this sign's about the height of the ceiling. You then wait for a gap in traffic on this motorway, travelling at 70 miles an hour, 112 kilometres per hour, and then you run, carrying this bloody great sign. Now I could never reconcile, don't put any bodies on the road in front of traffic, but then have people carrying this bloody great sign and running across a motorway. It just was totally out of whack. So I helped them develop up practices in the UK, a lot of it based on Australia and New Zealand, for how to safely implement those situations. 2009, I moved back to Australia. I'm based now in Brisbane and worked for a number of years for a major consultancy, again, helping contractors developing traffic management plans. 2013, basically I'd had enough of working for other people. I decided to set up my own company, and that's what I've been doing ever since. And in that role, I've fallen into the role of assisting government departments across the country with temporary traffic management. It started with a short contract with Transport and Main Roads in early 2013, a 3-month contract, to assist them rewriting some of their specs and guidelines. I'm still employed on contract by Transport and Main Roads Queensland 7 years later. So it just keeps rolling on because there's so much work happening in this field. So that's me, and that's why I'm interested in temporary traffic management. I will go back to my time at Main Roads because there was one incident which really triggered me quite early, that this was an area where I wanted to make a difference. And I'd only been in the job about 3 weeks. And as I said, I was responsible for standards, so I wasn't a project manager, I wasn't out on the road doing jobs. But I got a phone call. There's been a fatality at a roadwork site and a young traffic controller has been killed. We want you to go and investigate it purely from the aspects that you own the standards. Is there something about the standards that could have affected that? Now, I visited that site. It wasn't my job. It wasn't my work site. It was nowhere near where I lived. It wasn't my team. She wasn't one of my employees. But it just struck me at how badly that had hit everyone in the industry and everyone on that project, this incident and this fatality. Straight away I thought, this is somewhere where we can do better. There were a lot of things that I look at on that site and thought, that should not have happened. So the long and short, she was struck and killed by a roller working on the site. Now, there is absolutely no way that traffic management controllers should be interacting that closely with plant on a site. She had no escape route. There was a lot of issues with the setup. But, I mean, this is 20 odd years ago. But it really struck me straight away, we need to make a change. So I started the push and I got absolutely nowhere. Senior management, traffic management companies, contractors, basically, nah, it's all too hard. Yes, it's unfortunate, but in the main, we're pretty safe. Don't bother changing. Don't upset the apple cart. So that hit me and I lost a bit of faith in the industry at that time. So fast forward to now, and suddenly we've got projects nationally and across a number of states wanting to improve temporary traffic management. And I'm gratified I've finally got organisations who are interested and wanting to take this journey, a journey I've been on for 20 years. So, what triggered the current project, where it's all about? I told you I'm based in Queensland. Early 2011, 11th of January 2011, I remember that date well because it's my father's birthday. Brisbane got flooded. And this was a big flood, one of the biggest floods in the last 40 to 50 years. I live in the western suburbs. I was trapped at home for 9 days because all of the roads, every single road in and out of our suburb was cut somewhere. No power, no way in or out. I could have hiked 30 k's around to find my way back to civilization, but well, that wasn't happening. But it's not just the flood, it's the fact that there was probably about a metre's worth of rain over the preceding month across southeast Queensland. So roads had been washed out. There were landslips, road failures, the major highways from Brisbane up the range to Toowoomba and Warwick, they'd been cut off. They'd slid away, they were gone. The Bruce Highway North, which runs all the way up to Cairns, several thousand kilometres away, it was cut or gone in multiple places. 2 months after this flooding event, Cyclone Yassi hit North Queensland. Now, Yassi was a Category 5 when it hit. It was about 2,000 kilometres across in size, so it was massive. And it thumped North Queensland and then continued through southern and central Queensland, monumental amount of rain, and it washed away half the state, all the roads. So what we had was Queensland got $6 billion from the federal government for national disaster relief. That program funds 75% of the repairs, so Queensland had to fund the other 25%, so $8 billion worth of road repairs alone, which had to be done in a 2-year period to get the federal funding. On top of normal construction program and on top on normal maintenance activities and everything that local governments are doing and everything else. So, massive amount of work. So every contractor in the Southern Hemisphere pretty much set up an office in Queensland because there was work to be gained. Traffic management companies came out of the woodwork. If someone had a ute and a dog, they could have a traffic management company. Go and buy a few signs. They were popping up absolutely everywhere. And unfortunately, what it ended up with, we had a lot of bad incidents because there was just so much roadworks. There were crashes occurring at the back of queues. There were crashes occurring in work sites. And Camille, you mentioned it, Suzanne Cordell was killed in 2013. And Colin Cordell, he's never left southeast Queensland. He's been very active and his book was mentioned. I've got a copy of his book and I've read great chunks of it. It is an interesting read. But he has campaigned ruthlessly for changes in this industry. And so it was at that time when the Director General of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland, he started asking some questions because this had gone to the Minister, this had gone everywhere. He said, what is the state of temporary traffic management in our industry? So over the first period, around about 2014, I was then contracted, go out and do a review of sites in Queensland. How good are they? How good is the traffic management? We reckon it's great. Well, I found a 95% non-compliance rate. 95% of sites were not correct. Not all of them bad, some of them just signs a little bit out of place, maybe a few missing cones. Some of them pretty wonky. Some of them downright stupid. Left lane's closed, but actually the right lane's closed. Well, the public can work out that no one really knows what's going on. Worker symbolic sign, which is supposed to mean workers are on site, and it's just left there 24/7. Speed limits left out because it's just too inconvenient to remove them overnight. Let's just leave it at 40. Doesn't matter, does it? Well, what do the public think of that? That's why they always ignore 40s now, because they're left out all the time. I won't say always, because some of them are good. So basically what we reported back to the Director General was, it's not great. So the next question is, well, why is it so bad? Okay, how easy is it for someone to get into temporary traffic management in Queensland? So I went away and investigated all the training that was available, entry requirements and everything else. And what I found, and I'll paint a scenario for you, my daughter, and this is late 2014, finishing school, 17 years old, did not have her driver's licence at the time, smart cookie. She could go and sit the traffic controller course, which was a one-day course. So after one day, she can hold a stop-slow back on any road, any volume, any situation, anywhere in the state. She can hold a stop-slow back after one day. Now this is a high-risk industry, isn't it? But she could operate on any highway with road trains, B-doubles, whatever, after one day. The very next day, she could have sat the course to implement a traffic guidance scheme. One day. This is a diagram, this is what you need to do. Let's go out in the car park and set out some cones and signs. Yep, you've done that. Congratulations. So at the end of day 2, my 17-year-old daughter without a driver's licence could be taken to any site anywhere in Queensland and set up a site. She could be responsible for setting up a site and then controlling traffic with a stop-slow bat. Doesn't sound great, does it? Day 3, it's getting worse. The old course that existed at that time for someone to design and develop a traffic guidance scheme. Now, this session's going to go for about 2 hours today. If you could sleep through 4 hours of death by PowerPoint, it's about 400 slides, and then copy a drawing that you were given, you passed. So after 2.5 days, my 17-year-old daughter could design traffic management for any site anywhere in the state of Queensland. She could then go and implement it and control traffic. Now, is there anyone in this room who thinks that's a good idea? Hands up, please. Nope, still nobody. I asked the question this morning. Nobody's ever put their hand up in response to that question. But that was the situation that existed. And look, that's not too dissimilar to what probably exists elsewhere in Australia, including here. 2.5, 3 days, you're good enough to do any job with temporary traffic management. Doesn't matter who you are. So, I presented this to the Director General of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland. And so, 95% of sites are non-compliant, and that's how easy it is for someone to get any job in traffic management in the industry. Plus, setting up a company, anybody could set up a traffic management company. So he's sitting there thinking, as the Chief Executive of the state government department responsible for roads and all the maintenance works, I have obligations to ensure that all my employees and the public, under the Work Health and Safety Act, I have an obligation to make sure they're safe. Am I meeting that obligation? Hand on heart, he could not say that he was. So Queensland initiated a project saying we must do something about temporary traffic management. We must find a way to get compliance better, both in terms of its installation and then subsequently with driver compliance. And that was his goal. So back in 2013, so as I said, this was through 2014, we're doing lots of investigations. I'm still employed by the Department of Transport and Main Roads, and we are still developing practices to keep the message going. It doesn't just stop with publishing a guide and saying, there it is, everything's fixed. Awareness is going on, training is going on. We've now started the process of performance testing people who hold qualifications. And the department, to their credit, have started removing qualifications from people who do not pass that compliance check. The stick is there. Some companies have had their registration revoked because they're not competent enough. So the department is being brave and actually doing that, taking people off the road, taking companies, taking away their licence to do this job. And they need to do that to meet their work health and safety obligations, to ensure the safety of the public and ensure the safety of all workers. So look, this is a pretty daunting message. And as I said, it's still going. So 2015, Director General of Transport and Main Roads has got Queensland going. He also happened to be chair of the board of Austroads. So he presented this story to the board of Austroads, and the Austroads board is the chief execs of all the state and territory road authorities. And my understanding is that following that discussion, which was pretty short, pretty quick, everyone else agreed. No, we're not meeting our work health and safety obligations. Yes, we have problems. And hence this project that Austroads commissioned me for was introduced in 2015. So we started off with some very basic tasks: update the Australian standard, do a best practice review, try and get the training up. It evolved, and in 2016, there's the current phase. I've finished the project now, so my role as the project manager for the works that was going on finished up at the end of that stage. They initiated this project, which was based on a whole range of improvements to try and assist road agencies. So where we're at, and all credit to the TMAA and others as well, a steering committee was formed with a number of reps from the Austroads board, but also included industry, which included the TMAA, it included Roads Australia, the Australian Asphalt and Pavement Association, and the Australian Major Contractors Association at the time. And it was all recognised, this is a critical issue, we must do better. And look, their primary drive, they need to meet their work health and safety obligations. Even more so that industrial manslaughter laws are now starting to come in. They are in Queensland. I understand that they're going to be, it's already in this state, but will be formally introduced as of 1st of July. But with that, that puts a lot of onus on the chief execs and all management of all companies operating in traffic management to ensure the safety of all your workers. You can't just claim ignorance, you just can't claim, well, that's up to them. You have to have the processes in place. And it was mentioned earlier by Ben about companies need to continually assess the competency of the individuals working for them. And if necessary, send them for retraining. And if they're really just not getting it, say, I'm sorry, you can't do that job anymore, we're going to reallocate you to something else. So that was their goal. Obviously, they wanted to improve safety at road work sites. Frankly, I've read a few of them. I'd love to stop reading coroner's reports. I'd love to stop reading news articles about serious accidents that have happened across different states. So the projects that came out, Standards Australia agreed to update the Australian standard. Austroads agreed to develop a guide to sit alongside, a much more comprehensive guide based on the structure of the New Zealand Code of Practice. They also agreed to look at harmonising national training. As Ben said, that's probably still a couple of years away. And an investigation into pre-qual and registration schemes, and they're still doing a little bit of work in that space. The TMAA, CCF and others also agreed we're going to support this and we're going to help with awareness sessions, briefings around the country to make sure that everyone who needs to is aware of what's going on. So these sessions that I'm doing at the moment, I've done 3 here in Tasmania in the last 2 days. I did Victoria earlier this week, been to South Australia, I'm going to Northern Territory and WA next week. So this is going right around the country. And it's really about making sure that everyone who needs to know knows what they need to in this space. Today I'm going to talk just about the top 2 project elements there. The Australian Standard and the Austroads Guide. They're the 2 parts that have recently been published. And I just want to give you an update on what that means for you. So the Australian Standard, 1742 Part 3, published on the 11th of December 2019. If you hold the old version, great, but get online and download this new one. You do have to pay for Australian standards, unless you've got a subscription licence or whatever. The new one is out, and it's been out for over a month now, so I'd encourage you to find it and get it. With the Australian standard, Standards Australia never really liked the structure of the old standard. And the reason they didn't like it was that it contained a lot of material that they considered to be guidance. Now, guidance is not what Standards Australia is about. Standards Australia is about, this is a sign, it's this size, it's this shape, it's this colour, that's what the symbol on it looks like. They specify a standard for a device. They do not specify general guidance for how to use that device. That's not the role of Standards Australia. So they've always recognised this, but they've never done anything about it because up until now, there was no home for that material to go to and they didn't want to just delete it. Well, now there is a home. So given that Austroads was doing this project and agreeing to develop a guide to temporary traffic management, the committee responsible for this standard said, let's get all that material out. So an early part of the exercise was just going through with a big highlighter pen, highlighting everything that's going to be removed and then passing that across to Austroads to deal with. Issues like risk assessment, capture in a guideline. The standard will cover just the very broad principles, some of the processes, very briefly, but mainly point to the Austroads guide, and would come down to just describing the details of all the traffic control devices that you have available for you on the road. So, the structure of the standard. I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of it. You are going to, as I said, have to download it, you're going to have to read it. Section 1 has not changed massively. There's still a scope, there's still definitions, references, a short clause on the responsibility for safety at road work sites. That's all much the same. It hasn't changed much. There was some material which has now gone to the preface, so if you're thinking, oh, that seems to have vanished, that's where it's gone. There was also a section relating to the old field guides that were removed back in 2010, which the old standard talked about those guides. Well, they've now completely gone, so we've just deleted that clause. That's not there anymore. If you happen to hold some of those field guides, just please be aware, A, many of them weren't really correct, and B, they were badly misused. That's why they were withdrawn. So sections 2 and 3, and the reason I've lumped these together is that it talks about two distinct items, the traffic management plan and the traffic guidance scheme. And a lot of people use the two terms interchangeably. Please, they are different. They are very different. And I'll explain a lot more when we get to the Austroads guide. So the traffic management plan, to plan the job, it's a one-page section in the Australian standard, which basically just goes through and says, rough ideas about preparing it, now go to Austroads, read the Austroads guide. So that section is really just a pointer to Austroads. Section 3 of the standard talks about traffic guidance schemes and just lists out a series of dot points about preparation and implementation of traffic guidance schemes, and then again says, go to the Austroads guide for further information. There is some information in there about speed limits because that's a topic that the committee just couldn't let go of. They got twitchy when I said take it all away. They said, no, we've got to keep that. So some of that material is still in the Australian standard. So at this point, you're only up to about page 5 or 6 of the standard. The bulk of it is in section 4, and this is where you get the listing and the diagrams of all the traffic control devices that you have available. So all the signs, cones, etc. It's all in section 4. It's not substantially changed from what you would have seen in the old Australian standard. So all the devices that you saw there before, they're all still there. There are some new ones, and I'll take you through those. One of the things that we have done, though, is reorganise it a little bit, because Australian standards had a habit of when a new device comes along, tack it onto the end of the list. So reading it, it wasn't in any real sensible order. There was some stuff up here, some over here, some back there. You had to jump around. So we've reorganised it and batched together the signs and devices that make sense about being batched together. So you will see some reorganisation of it, but most of the material's still there. New stuff. Multi-message signs have finally got into it. And I say finally because when I was involved in updating the Australian standard back in 2002, which means it was 2001 when I was on the committee, Multi-message signs were being used in Queensland, they were being used in Victoria. I was responsible at the time for introducing them into West Australia because I thought they were a pretty good idea. The Australian standards approach is only to document what is already used by the vast majority of states. So at that time, it wasn't. So we just put a clause in saying some states use multi-message signs, go and see their documents for further guidance. 2009, the approach that they took when they updated the standard, the current version that you've probably been using, they just copied that across because they thought, oh, it'll be too much hard work, we'll leave it till later. Fast forward till now, when we're updating the Australian standard for the current version, the author who was employed to update the standard said, geez, that'll be a lot of hard work to include those, so I think we should just leave the clause and do it later. And myself and others just said, enough's enough. These things have been used for 20 years. Every state and territory uses them, except for RMS in New South Wales. But local government ignore the RMS guidelines and they use them everywhere in New South Wales. So everyone's using these things. We just cannot keep ignoring them. So we got them in. And yes, it's hard work, and yes, there's a lot of implications to that. But multi-message signs are now in the standard. There's a variety of different sizes there. I'll leave it up to you to work through which ones really work for you and so forth. But that's all in the Australian standard now. Boom barriers. These are a fairly new innovation. Alternative to traffic signals, but a replacement for the manual traffic control. We've recognised we needed to include the signage. That's now been included. So there's a set of signs which talk about what you need to do for boom barriers. The frustration I get with Standards Australia, and just to give you a feel for it, we probably spent 2 hours debating whether that red circle should be red or black or yellow. That's the level of discussion, because every state has their own. New South Wales uses the octagonal stop sign, not the round one. There's all sorts of issues with either of them. Doesn't really matter as far as I was concerned. It's about telling a message to the public. But that's where we go. We now have all the signs for boom barriers. Lane status signs, what you see on the left there, is the old version. And you can still use those. But they get a little bit difficult to tell a good message to a driver on the approach to an intersection, particularly when you get widened out and you've got multiple lanes and extra turn lanes and so forth. And so a number of states introduced the signs you see on the right for telling lane status at intersections. So that's now available as an option for you to use, depending on the message that you want to get across to drivers. There's a lot of signs now for managing cyclists, and you're going to hear me rabbit on about pedestrians and cyclists right throughout this presentation, because it's an area where, I hate to say it, but they're typically not well addressed. You talk with most traffic management people, what are they looking at? The risks to them and their workers. And pedestrians and cyclists don't pose much risk to them. They're looking at cars and trucks and vehicles. So they're worried about that. That's the risk element. Pedestrians, oh yeah, they cross the road, use the other footpath. We've got a sign for that. But it's a 6-lane undivided road, and you're telling the elderly people with mobility scooters and walking frames to cross this 6-lane road? Oh, yeah, well, yeah, that's what they'll do. Get real, that's not going to happen. Or alternatively, you're telling them to walk 500 metres back to the last set of traffic lights, cross at the lights, walk all the way down the other side of the street, and then cross at those lights up there and come back. What are you going to do?
We'll cross the road.
Are you? Shortest. Frankly, I'm going to duck out on the road and just run along 20 metres past the worksite and then keep going. And that's the problem. Realistically, and if I ask most of you, you'd all admit that's what a pedestrian's going to do. So by admitting that to me, you've admitted that you know that that's a likely outcome. You can't therefore say that sending them across the road is a reasonable practice. So you need to think of the alternative. So there's a lot of signs in there now about dealing with cyclists, dealing with pedestrians. New South Wales, there's a bicycle lobby group in Sydney who constantly send me photos and videos of crap roadwork sites, cyclists being forced to dodge around trucks onto the motorway lanes, all sorts of things, just stopped, basically got given no direction on where to go. They love sending me this stuff. It's a good library of photos for me. So you need to think about them. You also need to think about mobility scooters. In New Zealand, there was an incident, where they just simply said, pedestrians, here's your route. And it was off the footpath, onto the verge. It was rough, grassy, holes, etc. And unfortunately, a gentleman on his mobility scooter came along and followed that route, lost control, tipped over, hit the ground, banged his head and was hit by a vehicle and was killed. And when they talked to the traffic management company involved in that, it was, geez, who would have picked that had happened? Well, mobility scooters aren't rare. I'm sure if you wander around, you'll see them most days of the week. They're out there. Wheelchairs aren't uncommon. People with other mobility devices, it's not uncommon. So, yes, it happens. And if they'd really looked at the site and seen that there was an elderly person's home just around the corner, well, the likely thing around an elderly person's home is you're going to find elderly people who are more likely to use mobility scooters and other devices. So, they should have anticipated that. So it's a big issue, and I'll keep hammering it. We've had a lot of incidents in Australia as well with pedestrians and cyclists being hurt and killed at work sites. So the appendices to the standard, multi-message signs now make up the entire appendices. Appendix A is just a whole listing of all the signs and devices that you have available to you for multi-message frames, and there's a lot of them, so there's a lot of choices in there. Appendix B is just some examples of how to put them together. And it's just some of the basic messages that when you're talking to a driver, you don't have 3 panels all with text on it, because a driver cannot read 3 panels of text in the time that they see the sign. So you have to have symbolic signs combined with text. If you have a regulatory sign, like a speed limit or a no right turn or something like that, it has to be on the side closest to the traffic. Which means that if you're mirroring the signs in the median, and I've seen too many times where they simply do exactly the same design and then go and put in the median, no, you need to swap them across. You need to put the regulatory sign closest to the traffic. It's the way that they're made legal. So there's all those examples. All the other old appendices that you might be used for, that's where they've gone. So I've given you the references in the Austroads guide. This presentation will be available to you. I'm giving it to Ben and Annie, and they'll email it out to everyone who's put their name on one of the attendance registers. So it's another incentive to get your details down. So that's the Australian standard. So wrapped around that, we have the Austroads guide. The resources that you've got available at Austroads. You can download all 10 parts of the Austroads guide for free. There's the covers, you now know what they look like. They're freely available. You do have to register with Austroads, and that registration is with your email address and other details. That's primarily so that if they issue an amendment or an update, they know who to send them to, all the people who have downloaded it. So there's the 10 documents that are available. Supporting that, and I was project manager for developing all of that series, we also developed a set of webinars. So I got the consultants who developed each part, and I wrote 2 parts and delivered 2 webinars myself. But the consultants responsible for each of those webinars, each of those parts, delivered a 30-minute webinar which has been recorded. And that webinar just gives you half an hour discussion of the contents of that part of the guide, key messages, key things that you need to be aware of. Those webinars are all available on the Austroads website as well. You can download those and look at those at any time. Also, if you're particularly interested, the launch was run on the 11th of December last year in Brisbane, and you can download the video from that. You'll see me talking for another half an hour all about this lovely topic, and others introducing the guide. But that launch is available. So there are all the resources available to you. That's the Austroads web address. The material that I'm about to run through is quite purely and simply a summary of the information in those 10 webinars. So I'm just giving you a very brief run through. It's not all of the slides, it's not all the information, but just some of the key parts that I've picked out that I think will be of key interest to you in looking forwards. So, jump into them. Part 1. I wrote this part and it's magnificent. I don't expect it to be a bestseller, and I don't expect any of you to really read it probably more than once, if that's at all. Being an introduction, it just contains an overview of the rest of the series and some of the key parts. It doesn't contain a lot of technical information, so it really just sets the scene. But some of the key messages in that introduction, the the Safety at Road Worksites project. So a lot of the background that I've just given you, that's included in there. The background to this first edition of the guide. The structure of the guide and how to read it, and I'll take you through some of that, because that's the really important part. Is we've published this as 10 different parts so that people working in the industry, many of them will not need to read all 10 parts. And the New Zealand practice is to break it into chunks so that a traffic controller only needs to read that document. Field staff who only implement traffic guidance schemes, you only need to read that one. The designer, well, there's a few parts that you need to read, but it depends on what type of work you do. And we wanted to separate it out to try and make it easier so that at the moment, you tell a traffic controller you have to have the standard, well, they have to have the entire standard. And then finding the bits that are important to them can be bloody difficult. So what we're now doing is separating it out to try and make it easier for the readers of the document. Definitions, there's one set of definitions in the document, and it's all in part 1. So rather than have them scattered through the other 9 parts, and the risk of that is that we end up with the same definition in 2 different parts meaning different things, we've put one set of definitions, it's all in part 1 and it'll stay there. The principles behind temporary traffic management. Why we're doing what we're doing, what you should do. Particularly important if you find a site where you cannot comply with the guidance. And there will always be those sites. There'll be some site here in Hobart somewhere where despite everything, because of obstructions at the site, locations of intersections, locations of driveways, parked cars, whatever, you cannot comply with the guidance. And the principles then, go back to first principles, what we're trying to achieve with temporary traffic management. And that's there to help the designer who's faced with that situation then think, okay, I can't comply. What should I try and do instead, and how do I mitigate the issues? And I've done designs for sites that do not comply in any way, shape or form because they can't. But I've found ways to achieve the same outcome, and that's the important thing for me. The same safety outcome, the same outcome for traffic in a safe or a better way, but using different devices, using different layouts. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the future governance of the guide. So, that is the structure of the guide, the 10 parts that we have published. If you look down the left-hand side at the orange boxes, what you'll see there is that we've broken it into distinct roles or distinct phases that we think are important in temporary traffic management. So there's the overview, part 1. As I said, you'll read this document once and then it'll sit on the shelf. The next phase is to plan the job. Now, I know a lot of people use the terms traffic management plan and traffic guidance scheme interchangeably. Oh, they're the same thing, aren't they? No, they are different. The traffic management plan is planning the job. This is where, and I'll take you through a lot more in part 2, but this is where you work out what are you going to do with traffic before you start doing all the effort drawing up all the diagrams. Just little sketch diagrams. Where's traffic going to go? This is where you tell the local road authority, state growth or local road authority, whoever they are, I'm going to reduce this road from 3 lanes to 2 or from 2 lanes to 1. I'm going to put cyclists here, pedestrians here, these local residents that are affected, this is what I'm going to do for them. You just start telling a story before you start doing up the designs. Because if the local authority comes back and says, no, you're not doing that, well, you've wasted all your time doing the designs if you've done traffic guidance schemes before. So this is the planning phase of the job. The example I like to use is that I'm doing some work at home building a small retaining wall. This retaining wall's taken a few years longer than I would have liked, but I'm building it. Do I just jump in and start designing it? Is that the first step that I should do? Be easy to do, wouldn't it? Or be easy to just start digging a trench and doing something. No, I decided I'm going to plan this out first. First thing I'm going to do is go and talk to council and find out, are there any restrictions that I need to be aware of? And lo and behold, their instruction is it needs to be at least 250 mils back from the property boundary, otherwise you need to get your neighbour's approval. So I said, that's fine, I'll put it 250 mils away from the property boundary. I don't want to talk to those neighbours. So that's step 1. Step 2, they said, if it's a metre or more tall or high, you must get a structural engineering building approval for that structure. Now, I'm an engineer, but I'm a traffic engineer. I'm not a structural engineer. So I can't sign it off myself. Do I want to employ a structural engineer to sign off a retaining wall? Not a chance. I'm not paying for that. So I found a system that's 980 millimetres high. I looked around and there's a lot of manufacturers have these systems that fit just under that metre. I've got one of those. It means I have to have a step part way through that area that I want to level, but that's cool. So that's me planning the job. I've done all that to work out what I need to know prior to me building. Then I've gone away and done the design before I started the construction. Same thing with temporary traffic management. We do the plan. Once you've got the plan approved and you know everything's going to work, then you do the design, then you go out in the field and do the job. And they should be done in those steps. There's too many sites, unfortunately. People get out on site and then start drawing up a sketch or a mud map on site and saying, oh yeah, I'll try and make this work. They've skipped over the early stuff. So we plan the job, and that's covered in part 2 of the guide. We then design the job. We develop the traffic guidance scheme diagrams. And that's covered in parts 3 for static worksite, part 4 for mobile works, and part 5 for short-term low impact works. The 3 parts separated out because there's a lot of organisations that may only do one or other of those. A lot of companies might only use mobile works. A lot of ancillary companies who do landscaping, for example, they're never actually on the road, they're always on the verge. Short-term low impact. Utility authorities, telecommunications, gas, power, etc. They're on the verge, they don't need to be on the road. Short-term low impact covers nearly all of their situations. So there's 3 separate parts for the design. We then get to the field. The implementer. Part 6 deals with field staff. The tasks that they should undertake a day in the operation of an implementer. Part 7 deals with traffic controllers. Then we've got some supporting parts. Part 8 is processes and procedures, which really is aimed at companies, those preparing contracts, government agencies and the like, setting the scene for traffic management. Part 9 is some sample layout diagrams, and part 10 is other supporting guidance. Basically a home for something where we couldn't find a home somewhere else, so we've just dumped it all together. So that's the general structure. The development of the guide, just so you're aware of where it's all come from. We have not embarked on an exercise to completely revamp everything that you've done in the past. So the guidance is based on what was in the existing Australian standard. It's based on some practices that were in the New Zealand Code of Practice, which may not have existed in Australia or may be a slight improvement. And it's based on the differences that different jurisdictions had. So WA, they had their own guidance. South Australia has their own field guide. Queensland has its own MUTCD. New South Wales has its TCORS manual. Tasmania, you had a very short document. Victoria's got a whole range of documents that don't really collect together. But everyone had their own stuff, and some of it was pretty damn good, where they'd encountered stuff. So we've gathered all that together, found the best of it, and put it into the guide. Importantly, what it means is that what you see in a design tomorrow, if you were to apply the guide, will not be massively different from what you see in a compliant design that you've prepared today. And I say compliant because there's a lot of designs that are not compliant. So the guidance, it's much the same. There are some differences and you need to wade through the documents to find it. I'll highlight some of the key ones for you today. But the guidance was based on best practice, and the approach that we've taken in developing this guide, we want to be a beacon for best practice, not the lowest common denominator that everyone would agree to. So there are some states and territories that won't agree with some of this stuff, and we've had to say, well, the majority do want that, so I'm sorry, we're leaving you behind and we're going with it. So we had a working group to prepare this. This wasn't just me and consultants writing these documents. The working group oversaw and made the decisions with regards to the documents. It involved representatives from every state and territory, road authority. It involved representatives from local government, and it had industry representatives as well. And the intent was, we want to get broad industry input. We want to get the best input from those people who actually do it on the ground. I don't want people who sit in their towers all day writing guidance for a traffic controller. No, let's get traffic controllers involved in this. Every part of the guide was put out to industry consultation. Some parts had more than 2,500 downloads. So we were getting a lot of people downloading the parts that we put out for industry consultation. Unfortunately, the feedback we got, about similar to what I just got right then in this room. Very little. 2,500 downloads, 20 minor comments come back. Okay, well, that's great, we're going ahead with it. So that's where the materials come from. Importantly for you, and this is perhaps for you today, one of the most important slides. Who should read what? Because when you put it out, when you publish it all, the 10 parts, the Austroads Guide plus the Australian Standard, it's going to be a fairly daunting pile of paper. Very daunting compared to what used to exist before. And I can just imagine a lot of people going, holy mackerel, where the heck do I start with this? So, this is to try and help you with that. So what you see on this slide, we've got the three major roles within traffic management. The traffic controller, the person who operates a stop-slow bat or a portable traffic control device. The implementer, the person who is responsible for putting all the temporary traffic management on site, complying with the traffic guidance scheme, taking it and putting it into reality on the site, monitoring it through the day, removing it at the end of the day. The designer, who's responsible for developing the traffic management plan and then developing up the traffic guidance schemes. Surrounding those three roles, we've also recognised there may be workers out there who don't hold any of these qualifications at all. They might just be a truck driver, a labourer, an apprentice, whatever. So what we've said is let's recognise that they're there as well. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got the RIM, the Road Infrastructure Manager. And the reason we've chosen that term is that not only do you have road authorities, but you've also got private road operators as well. Particularly Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, there's a lot of privately operated toll roads. So Transurban, other companies, they run those roads. They operate them, they own them. You've also got mining roads, you've got port roads, you've got roads in national parks. So there's a lot of them which are owned and operated by organisations who are not road authorities. So anyone who is responsible for a road, project managers for projects, the contractor who's also responsible for the overall works that are going on, not just the temporary traffic management, and then the temporary traffic management company. Now what you've got in this table, hopefully it's fairly obvious. If it's in blue and it's a lead role, that person needs to have an intimate knowledge of that part of the guide. Consider that your Bible. That's the one that you need to be able to pick up and know where things are. I won't say you need to quote it word for word. I've helped write these. I can't quote them word for word. But I know where stuff is and I know where to find it. And if you're a designer, that's your role, is get in and know these documents. If you're an implementer, well, part 6 is your important one. If you're a traffic controller, part 7. So you can see what we're trying to do there. If it's green and a supporting role, you need to have a pretty good knowledge of what's in there, but not know it back to front. Because you'll be involved in interacting with the people who are doing that. So for example, an implementer needs to know about part 5, which is short-term low impact works. It contains a lot of the clauses which will actually be used for how they put signs out in the devices on the road. When they put cones out, they're doing it typically either protected by a work vehicle or waiting for a gap in traffic. These are all short-term low impact clauses and they should be complying with them. Because they're managing or supervising traffic controllers, they all should have a pretty good idea what a traffic controller role is. So, the blue, you need to know it back to front. The green, you have to reasonably good knowledge. Intermediate knowledge, next level down, I characterise that, you need to know the table of contents of the part. So that you know, okay, that part's there, I don't need to use it a lot, but I know what the general content is. General knowledge, basically we're saying everyone should know there are 10 parts. I don't want someone to come and say, oh, I use part 3, that's all there is, isn't there? No, everyone should know there are 10 parts, and that's where it's at. So, general knowledge, you know there are 10 parts. Intermediate knowledge, you know the table of contents for that part. Green, you've read it, you've got a fairly good idea what's in there. Blue, you know that part back to front. So this is where I encourage you now to think about yourselves. Think about the people that work for you. Don't just give them the whole series and say, here, learn this. Think about breaking it up and working out who needs to use what. Who are the planners and designers in your team? Who are the implementers? Who are the traffic controllers? Get people reading the individual parts. So as I said, I think that's one of the most important ones that you need to know about at the moment. So in part one, we talk about planning and design. Key principles: safety, everyone. Road workers, the public. You want to create an efficient temporary traffic management. And what we mean by that is make it right for the site for a start. Don't make it really long. There's too many sites that you see that, well, we're going to be here over the next six months from here to here, so let's just set it up all the way from start to finish right now. There's no one actually going to be in that last 5 kilometres of job for the next 3 months, but let's set it up. No, keep it short, keep it tight, keep it efficient. Because it's about the customer experience. You are not designing temporary traffic management for you. Who are you designing it for?
Road users.
Thank you, road users. You must design it for the road user. If you drive through and go, yep, everything's where it should be, that's great, you've not done your job. Drive through it from the perspective of my 18-year-old son who only got his licence late last year and isn't terribly confident, doesn't have loads of experience. Will he understand your site? Think about it from the perspective of my 80-year-old mother. Eyesight's starting to go at her age. She suffers from vertigo, so she loses her confidence a bit, can't turn her neck as much. Will she understand her site? I have driven through sites where I've gotten lost and I consider myself to be relatively expert in this field. Now, if I'm getting lost in your site, you've got a massive problem. But you need to think about, you will have all types of drivers driving through your site. Are you near an international airport where there are international tourists hopping into hire cars and driving around? Will they understand your site and know what to do? Will any part of the, this obviously has hit a nerve. Will any part of the community understand your site? That's who you're aiming at, not yourself. And this is about taking off your professional goggles and thinking from the perspective of any other driver, is it 100% crystal clear what I need to do? And so the principles: uniformity. 2 sites on the same road doing the same thing, surely they should look just about the same. If you want the customer, the driver, to react the same way, you want them to be the same. Fit for purpose. Don't have your signs for 3 kilometres when your work site's 20 metres long. Don't leave the work symbolic signs out when workers are not there. Don't leave speed limits out because it's just too inconvenient to change them. It has to be fit for purpose at every time any driver comes through. Some key design principles. Now we'll talk about designing for the driver. That's your target. One of the key things I love to say at this point, and I'll stop for a break in just a minute, is we all talk about traffic control. Let me break this illusion. You do not control traffic. You are not jumping into the car, controlling the steering wheel, controlling the brake, the accelerator. You're trying to influence a driver to do the right thing. You are not controlling them. I know we all like to think we're traffic controllers, and it's a term we use, but let's be real, you're influencing them. Because there are drivers who, for whatever reason, may disobey what you're doing. The safe system. We need to recognise that even a fully compliant driver can sometimes make a mistake. When I'm driving in an area which I'm completely unfamiliar with and I'm looking around trying to work out where I should be going, it's entirely plausible that I might miss a set of traffic lights and go through a red light. Or I might miss a turn and have to do a very tight turn halfway through an intersection that I really shouldn't be making. It happens. I could lose control. I live in Queensland, and just looking at the messages from my kids yesterday, we had 250 mils of rain at home yesterday. So talking to my wife, and she was on her way home from work, and she said, I'm aquaplaning all over the place because the water's this deep on the motorway. So even strange circumstances, drivers can lose control. Should your workers be penalised with death or serious injury because of those situations? Do you simply say, look, we're at a compliant site, too bad, here's your coffin? Is that acceptable? No. So we need to think at all times, how do we maintain the safety? How do we recognise the risks that might come about? So there's some of the key principles that you need to be aware of. Future governance of Austroads, I mentioned this before, this is not a static document. This document, frankly, I want you to open it up and tear it to pieces. I'm not precious about the fact that I project managed the publication of this or that I authored some parts. If you think it's crap, please tell us. If you think there's a far better way to do something, please tell us. There's an email address there at the bottom, austroads@austroads.com, that's not .au. That's nice and easy. So please, don't just send us an email and say, this is crap, because I sit there, what do I do with that? Send me an email and say, this is crap because, and this is what I would do better. Give us the information. We want you, during this current period where it's not actually mandatory for you to use it, pull it apart. Tell us of any practice which you think is not practical. Send the information through. Austroads is committed to updating these documents on an annual basis if necessary. The intent being we'd much rather have small incremental updates, and then I can come back to you in 12 months' time and say, the things that have changed are this. And it's just a 1-hour session, and I just tell you what the changes are, and you will go away informed of what's going on. Rather than me coming back in 5 years and saying, here's a brand new pile, now you have to start reading it from scratch. So the intent is small incremental updates year on year as improvements come through, reactive to improvements in the industry. So look, we'll stop for a short break there. I've got 10 past 2 on my watch because I'm still on Queensland time. It's 10 past 3. So if we just 5-minute break, toilet, grab a coffee and come back in here at 15:15 and we'll finish off. Thank you. What I'm going to do now is just quickly jump through the next 9 parts. I spent a fair bit of time on part 1, not because I wrote it, but because it provides the introduction that I think many of you need to understand how to use the rest of the series and the important parts of it. So as I said before, the material that I'm presenting now is all a summary of the material that's available in the webinars for each of these 9 parts. So if you think a particular part is important to you, please head back to that one. So part 2 on traffic management planning. Part 2 deals with the objectives of the traffic management plan. And I think hopefully I've described to you now the difference between a traffic management plan and the traffic guidance scheme. The objective of the traffic management plan, imagine you're submitting a plan. Imagine Ben sitting at the back is the one at the state growth to receive that plan. What you're trying to do at this stage of the work is just tell him a story which shows him or gives him confidence that you know how you're going to do the job and manage traffic. That you understand all the stages of the job, what you're going to do with pedestrians, what you're going to do with cyclists, what you're going to do with traffic, what you're going to do with local property owners, what you're going to do with local farms, all of those types of issues, and how you are going to integrate the works with the needs of the community. So it's really about that. It's about getting the confidence that Ben, in this particular case, can turn around and say, yes, I understand what you're going to do. Because when the complaints start coming in or the ministerials come into the government, who's going to receive them? Ben will, not you. He'll be the first one. And he needs to be in a position where he can sit there and say, yes, I know about this job. It's not a complete mystery to the department. Yes, I know what impact they're having on the transport network. I know that that road was going to be reduced from 3 lanes to 1. Yes, I know what we're doing with all those issues. And yes, we understood the impact it was going to have and we were prepared to accept that. That's the position that people in a road authority need to be in when they receive those questions or comments from the public or anyone else. You don't want it to be a mystery and he's going, they did what? Because that doesn't help anyone. So, traffic management planning. Basically, it's just a risk assessment. What are all the issues you're going to face? Your typical road out there, you're going to have pedestrians, you're going to have cyclists, you're going to have drivers. That's your three basic categories. You may or may not have public transport. You will have local property owners who want to access their properties. And don't think, oh yeah, we'll just close off access for 24 hours, because I'm not sure of too many property owners to say that's a good idea. And always think, despite you perhaps getting agreement to close off access to 15 residents, if one of them has a heart attack, an emergency vehicle still needs to get in. So you still need to consider how that's all going to happen, how you're going to have access. Commercial properties, don't just look at opening hours, because I don't know about you, but most shops get their deliveries outside of retail hours. If they want repairs or maintenance done, has to be done outside of hours. So you need to think about all of those properties. Where's the local parks? Where's the local schools? This hockey centre, Ben, I think you said it, well, Ben's gone now, but Thursday night is when all the matches happen. So don't do something around here on a Thursday night. Find out all of those types of issues that you need to be aware of. So you need to find all these risks, what's the source of it, what's the likely impact on your job, and how you're going to deal with it. And that's what traffic management planning is about. You're going to see this diagram a couple of times through this presentation. It's the hierarchy of control. What is the best way to manage your risk?
Get rid of it.
Get rid of it. Eliminate the hazard. You go to standard risk management practice right across the globe. The best level of control, eliminate the risk. So in traffic management, that means close the road. Get rid of traffic. Either detour it, sidetrack it, or contraflow it down the other side of the carriageway on opposite right. Now, I'm pragmatic. That's not always going to be practical. But what you have to do in traffic management planning is at least show that you've considered it. Don't just rule it out of hand. Because the typical practice is someone says, I need to work here. Many people, okay, here's a plan I used last week. Here, use that. That's a traffic guidance scheme, which just shows traffic here, workers right here, next to each other. So straight away, in most circumstances, we're jumping to the lowest level of control, which is past the work site. Now, if something was to happen at that work site, and work health and safety would come investigate, can you demonstrate that you've considered all the higher levels of control? Okay, maybe a detour is not practical, but in a residential area with a grid network, geez, you can close the road, it's only 50 extra metres around, traffic can go around. New South Wales is perhaps leading the way in this. You don't so much have it here, but right up the east coast, all the tunnels in Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, when they're doing maintenance, they advertise the closure 2 weeks in advance and say, this tunnel, westbound, will be closed 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. on this date. And it's closed. So it was a recent trip I had. I was driving to the airport. I have to drive through 2 of those tunnels to get to the airport. One of them, I knew that it was closed 2 weeks in advance and wouldn't be open when I'm trying to drive through, because I was trying to drive through at about 4:30 in the morning. So I already knew I had to plan an alternative and that it was going to take me an extra 10 minutes to get to the airport. But you're told in advance, they don't do any work under traffic in tunnels. In New South Wales, they've taken this further and they're doing that with most of their motorway network now. They will not do maintenance works on a motorway under live traffic. What they'll do is they've got places where you can cross from one carriageway to the other. They divert all the traffic across, contraflow it down the other carriageway, and have a complete carriageway clear to do all their maintenance work. And while they're doing that, they flood it with every activity: line marking, drainage, barrier repairs, signage, the whole lot. Do it all at once. But what it means, they've eliminated the hazard.
They also design their roads that they can do that.
Yes, they do. Safety and design, so perhaps it should be designed that way in the first place. But for all of your sites in traffic management planning, what you need to do is think about this process. The safest way to deal with the hazard or deal with the risk is to eliminate it. And if you can't show that you've at least considered it, and don't just put, it's too inconvenient. No, that's not the answer. Have a real considered story. Convince me that it's not practical. Don't just tell me it's not, convince me it's not. So you need to step through that hierarchy. So around the work site, a detour, sidetrack. Through the work site, you used to see it a lot on rural roads when they're doing upgrades. You close the road with traffic controllers at each end, traffic signals now, of course. You do it, close at 15 minutes and all your workers do what you do, then all the workers get out of the way, you let the traffic through one direction at a time. When it's all cleared, you then close it again, get another 15-minute window, keep working, etc. Maybe it's half an hour. But that way you don't have workers and traffic occupying the same space at the same time. Lastly, the lowest level of control is past. It's having traffic there, workers right there. And that's one of the lowest levels of control. So please think about how you're going to justify selecting that for the next work site that you're at. Were these other options available? You don't have to write War and Peace on it, but just show that you've considered it. So part 2 of the guide talks about the common components of a traffic management plan and some of the guiding principles. These documents don't need to be War and Peace. I've done a traffic management plan which is frankly 2 pages. It's enough to demonstrate all compliance with this for a small job. I've also seen one which was 6,500 pages for a massive job in Brisbane. So somewhere in between. So it's scalable. The whole intent being make sure that you can demonstrate it for your project. So when developing the traffic management plan, what should you do? There's some introductory activities that you need to undertake. What I always say, the ideal, if you hire me to develop a traffic management plan for a job, what would be the best way for me to identify the issues on the job? Visit the site. So one of those introductory activities. Familiarise myself with the site. Familiarise myself with what it is that the contractor needs to do. It's no good with me coming up with a traffic management plan for a repaving job when it's actually a drilling rig. Know what the job's about. Know how the contractor wants to do the work. So you do all of that. You then do a risk assessment. That's what I was just talking about. Identify all the risks. Once you've evaluated each risk, you've got the options, you've got your preferred outcomes, then you can develop up your traffic management plan. One of the things that I really love to point out is these ongoing activities, monitoring and review and communication and consultation. Because quite frankly, if I develop a traffic management plan and you go and implement it and it doesn't work, I'd rather you came back and told me that rather than just keep doing the same thing day after day. Feedback. Feedback into the loop. I want to learn what worked, what didn't work. And every designer, everyone who's preparing a traffic management plan should be doing the same. Is always consider that feedback loop. So these are just a couple of examples. This is taken from one of the assignments that's given in the design course in Queensland. You've got a work site here, which is that little red and yellow blob. It blocks the footpath. So we talked before about pedestrians. What are my options? Well, I could get them to go back, cross the road at the lights, come all the way down the other side and then come back across here. And who was it that said, how likely do you reckon is pedestrians going to do that? Well, no. So we all know that, okay, let's be honest. But at least I've considered, I know where the option is. Because if that detour was perhaps just that route, well, that's more likely, isn't it? Other detour, I could put them down the footpath here, through the car park and around the back. Alternatively, I could just create a little path through the garden there and then have them a defined area in the car park, back up this footpath over here and back on. Last alternative is that I could take out a lane on the road with barriers and give them a protected space on the road. But then I'd have to put in ramps down to the road and I'd have to make sure it's protected, plus it gets in the way of deliveries. This is me assessing the options. Now I've just told you probably in 2 minutes all the options on this. Doesn't take long. But it tells you a story, doesn't it? And it's about me communicating this story so that when I submit a plan to the road authority, they can see, oh yeah, Dan's looked at all the options, happy with this. I then tell a story about why I picked which option I did, which, by the way, was the red one. So my client can look at it and say, yes, you've seen all the options. I don't want my client saying, well, what about this? What about this? You didn't consider these, because I've failed in my job. So this next one, it's a bit hard to see all of it, but basically it's then the staging diagram for this part of the works and it shows everything. So traffic, I'm reducing it from 3 lanes to 2, back out to 3. Pedestrians, that blue line, that's the route I'm following. There's a bus stop here. I've noted that it's in the way of the merge taper, but I'll just put a break in the taper so the buses can still get to the bus stop. Hotel, there's an access up here, I've noted it. It will be in where my signage is, but it's not affected. And the works depot area, and so forth. So that's, again, me telling a story for that stage of the works, what I'm going to do with every major traffic issue on that site. So that exercise I showed you for pedestrians, I've done that for every other mode of traffic at that site. I've considered all the options, I've presented it, that's a planning. Does that plan tell you a story? Yep. Tells you what I'm planning to do on the job. No signs or cones or other devices yet, is there? Just a very simple little diagram telling you where is everybody going to go? How have I dealt with that driveway? And we've got other examples where we've done a similar thing. And that's the outcome of your traffic management plan. So, once you've done the planning, let's get into the design. Part 3 on static work sites. Look, these are the ones that you probably use most commonly. What we've done through there is identify there are a lot of risks, and we've got this bloody great table of all the risks that we initially considered and could think of that you might find there. Don't treat that list as a tick all the boxes. Find the ones that are relevant for you at a particular work site. Add on extra ones which we haven't thought of. So as an example, you might think of all the normal things. When I was in WA, we were dealing with some sites and we were looking at roadworks, and it's blue gum plantation timber. Now, if you know anything about blue gum, they plant it, 10 years later they come back and harvest it. So for 10 years, there is no traffic on some of these roads. But during that harvest season, there's double and triple road trains every 3 minutes. And it might only last for 3 months. So we mapped out where all of these places were, which ones were going to be harvested, what months, what years, because they're doing it on a rotational basis, and said, okay, because they're harvesting there, we're not going to do anything on those roads during that 3-month period. Let's wait. Either do it before, do it afterwards. Probably afterwards, because the road trains will chew up the road. So there's just different variations wherever you go. Most agricultural products, there's a once a year harvest or twice a year. Know when that harvesting happens. If it's grain, again, when they're harvesting grain, you've got road trains backwards and forwards all the time. So think about all of the risks that you're likely to find out on a site and that you need to consider. Once you've done that and once you've addressed them, you need to design your site. Now this diagram, can you read it at the back? No? Can you read it at the front? I can't read it either. Okay, where we're at, 3 columns. Around the work site, through the work site, past the work site. Where did we see that before? When we're looking at risk and the hierarchy of control. Okay? It goes through each step. So step 1 is find out which one of these are appropriate, and then there's a series of steps. The guide is written, surprisingly, with a small subsection for each of these steps in that order. So that you gradually work through building up your traffic guidance. What do I need for this part of the site? What do I need for this part? And gradually build your traffic guidance scheme. So it's done in that order. It's also presented with around the work site first, because that's the highest degree of risk control. Static work sites, I'll skip forwards. That's probably the diagram you're most familiar with. It's from the Australian standard as a typical worksite layout, isn't it? It's also the lowest level of control. So it shouldn't be the typical that we're presenting, this is just what you do. But that's what the Australian standard's always presented. So we've gone back, around the worksite is presented first. And we've got a typical layout diagram for around the worksite. Those steps that you see, they correspond with each of these different areas that need to be worked on. So at the work area, how do you protect the work site itself? Safety buffer, how should that be? In this area, after your road closure, you're going to have, how do you do the road closure? How do you allow local access? How do you keep that safe? The advanced warning, what are all the advanced devices? You've got the around route, how do you sign that? Termination area, what you need to do there. So you step through working out your design for each of those areas. Same thing for through the work site, same thing for past the work site. Just hopefully a nice and straightforward process for doing that. You'll notice on this diagram we've added in this additional warning area. The reason for that is that Previously, the transition, the taper, ran straight into the safety buffer. But there's a lot of new devices out there, truck-mounted attenuators, variable message signs, arrow boards, trailers, things like that. Useful devices to have there to help reinforce the message for drivers to make sure they're in the right lane. Under the previous standard, the guidance was the transition area, you are not allowed to put any devices in that area. And the reason you're not allowed to put it is because that's where vehicles might lose control and end up. The safety buffer, well, nothing's allowed in there because that's a buffer where if you put something in and it gets hit, it's going to fly into the work site and hurt your workers. So previously, you couldn't put anything in there at all. Recognising that we want these devices, we've created this additional warning area. So that's been added in there for you to consider if you want to put these in. If you want to park your vehicle with your flashing arrow board, that's where it goes. If you want to put in a truck-mounted attenuator because that's what you need, that's where it goes. So that's one of the key changes that we've introduced, recognising that you may need to build more into your site. We no longer use dimension D because it was wildly misused. What we've now got is about spacings for signs, and we've just tidied them all up. They may be a little bit different to what you're used to because there were differences between every state and territory, and we've listened to all the arguments and we've come up with a slightly amended set. One of the important things though is this sight distance to the sign. I can't tell you how many situations I've seen where driving through a work site, and I can see a case where a traffic installer has said, well, the guidance scheme says put the sign here, so in between these two parked cars it goes. In that bush, yep, that's where I'm putting it, because that's where the diagram says to put it. Ironically, I have seen a sign on 2 metre high posts, so someone's gone to the trouble of putting these posts in to put a sign on, this far behind a power pole. Not in front of the power pole, behind it. Now we all laugh and smirk at this, but these things happen regularly. I guarantee you, if I was to drive around Hobart today, I would find some signs put in some bloody stupid places. All right? Considering the driver. What does a driver need to do? They need to see the sign, they need to interpret it, read it, and react to it. There was guidance for permanent signs, and we've simply adopted it and created a table which tells you the distance for every speed where a sign needs to be seen. So in this case, 90 metres. The expectation is the sign gets put in place, someone should go back 90 metres down the road to where the driver's eyesight will be. Can I see the sign? And the intent of that is we want every sign and device to be seen.
Can I just say something? In Tasmania, the roads in Tasmania are very tightly cornered to get that at 90 metres, or even a variation of 90 metres. It could be 100.
Okay.
Could be 180 metres.
I love this question.
Before you can
So, if you find you cannot get the sight distance, what do?
keep the movement till you do.
You could, or you could put a second sign in. So if it was 180 metres, put one at 180, put another one at 270. Double them up. You need to investigate your site and see, how can I achieve the same outcome? I want a driver 180 metres before this point to have seen this sign. And so maybe the first one, it's just, geez, I only see a bit of it, but then they see it again. So you need to think about mitigating factors, how you're going to achieve that. Yep. Okay, so moving on. Part 3 also has a lot of information about safe speeds. That has not substantially changed from the previous Australian standard. Traffic control devices. Portable traffic control devices should be the number one consideration, not a manual traffic controller. I talked about the story in the UK where you don't see them. Queensland has now mandated that on any road 80 kilometres per hour or greater, you shall not use a manual traffic controller. You shall use a portable traffic control device, and that's either the portable boom barrier or traffic signals. And that's mandatory. And other states have said that's a good idea and starting to move that, and hence the documentation reflects that that should be the primary choice. Unfortunately, what Annie and Ben and I saw as we drove down from Launceston yesterday was the traffic controllers who were then operating those devices. The whole idea of having this device is what? Get the traffic controller away from the road. So when they're sitting on the trailer, that's not achieving the outcome. Get 3 metres up the hill, get away from the bloody road, please. So the intent of this is to get soft human bodies away from traffic. There's a much more detail on traffic controllers in part 7. There's also about how to design for additional issues, vulnerable road users, pedestrians and so forth, and also consider public transport. Another of the big issues I want to talk about is that the designer should think about how will the traffic guidance scheme be installed. It's no good me developing a diagram and giving it to you, you getting out on the site and saying, I can't do this. You've said put these signs here, there's a 15 metre drop off the embankment here, the signs won't fit. I won't have done my job as a designer if that's what you've got. I need to know how it's going to be installed. I need to know that it can be installed, what the practice should be. And the principles are, this is about safety and design. I as the designer should say, how will it be installed? How will it be maintained? If I'm requiring road workers to run across a motorway every 2 hours to change a speed limit sign, that's not on. I need to find an alternative mechanism. How will it be removed? And there's a lot more guidance in part 6. The story I like to tell at this point is that with installation, it should also be kept straightforward too, kept simple. And thinking about the installation process, I want to outline it because the reason being is I as a designer may not know who is actually putting it out on the road. It may be you, and I know you've got stacks of experience and you know exactly what you're doing. Maybe you, and you might be a trainee who got your course yesterday. I don't know who's doing it. So the best way for me to ensure that my design ends up on the road 100% the way that I designed it is to make the instructions as simple and as clear as possible. The story I like to give, it's a few years old now, my youngest son, when he was 10 or 11 or thereabouts, he loved Lego. We bought him this big box of Lego, 2,500 pieces, VW Beetle, got its own little motor, you put the batteries in, it'll run around the room. Okay? How much Lego do you reckon that Lego would sell if he opened the box and tipped it out and out came 2,500 pieces and a picture of what it looks like at the end? I think he would have started throwing those Legos around the room and I would have just ended up with 2,500 pieces of Lego in the vacuum cleaner. But no, he opens the box, out falls 9 numbered bags. Big instructions. Do not open bag number 2 until you've finished bag number 1. Okay, open up bag number 1. Out fall the pieces. They're all different colours. There's a book. Instruction number 1. Find these 2 pieces, put them together this way. Instruction number 2. Find these 2 pieces, put them together this way. Instruction number 3. Take those 2 pieces and put them onto the first 2 this way. Nice pictures, nice clear. It's 2 hours later, my 11-year-old son has put together this 2,500 piece Lego puzzle and it's driving around the room. And he's absolutely delighted by it. And that's how Lego keeps selling the stuff. It's simple, no words, anyone, any language can do it. Traffic management, the designer needs to think of the same. How can I make sure this ends up on the road no matter who is putting it together? And the designer needs to think about that and make sure the instructions are crystal clear. What needs to go out, what order, how it needs to come together. So that's a big step because many designers I've spoken to in the past say, no, this is my drawing, it's up to them to work out how to do it. That's their job, not mine. Well, my job as a designer is to always make sure that anything I design can actually be built on site. The same goes for temporary traffic management. So part 4, mobile works. To be brutally honest, this part is one of the ones that I'm least happy with. When we first went to industry about mobile works, we had a lot of feedback that the current practices in the Australian standard are unworkable, they don't align with current equipment or plant, etc. We need something else. So I said, okay, tell us what you do, give us your best practice. And I got back, crickets. Nothing. So we have been forced to basically document up what was in the existing Australian standard. We can't change it if we don't know what's better and if industry doesn't tell us. So this is a part, if any of you are involved in mobile works and you find this don't work, please start sending your comments through to Austroads. As I said before, don't just whinge and complain about how bad it is. Tell us what we need to do to make it better. So, but what we have done is try to break it down again, same as previously, into nice simple steps. Firstly, can mobile works be used? There's a lot of people who use it inappropriately. So we have a whole suite of questions. If you can answer yes to them, yes, mobile works is appropriate. Identify which lane the works are going to be in. If you're working on 4 different lanes, my best practice is I won't just give you one TGS and say, yeah, here's what a convoy for mobile works looks like. I'll give you 4 of them. To do the left edge line, you do this. To do the first lane line, this is where your works vehicle should be. To do the second lane line, this is where your works vehicle should be. To do the right edge line, this is where it should be. Not hard to do, because frankly, once I've done the first one, it's just, okay, copy and then move vehicles around to comply with the different lane requirements. It's not a hard task. But that's best practice. That's making sure, that's me, making crystal clear to those people out on site for each lane where each of the vehicles should be. No confusion. So, we have to know where the works location is. Next, we work out what vehicles do we need in our convoy, and it varies depending on whether it's a 2-lane, 2-way road, whether it's a one-way carriageway, whatever it might be. It depends on speed, where your vehicles are, how many lanes you want to close off, etc. So there's guidance on picking that. The spacing between vehicles. And the spacing is a nasty balance. If a vehicle is too close to the one in front, it doesn't do its job, because when it's hit, it gets shunted into the one in front, or the workers in front. So we need them back far enough. You pull back too far, and the risk is that drivers go around a tail vehicle and start pulling back in. So as I said, it's a nasty balance. We've got numbers which the working group were generally happy with, but again, we'd love feedback on that. Signs and devices, additional devices that you can put on your vehicles. I do need to say, we've put speed limits on these. Just be aware, speed limits on vehicles actually have no legal meaning. All the legislation, I'm pretty sure in every state and territory, is that a speed limit is defined by a sign which is at a set location on the side of a road. Having it on a vehicle, it's not enforceable. We've included it for 2 reasons. One, we reckon it's better than not. Secondly, we've put up a request to the Road Rules Committee to consider the introduction of this onto vehicles so that it can be enforceable. But just be aware of that. The police can't come out and enforce it. Lastly, when you're finishing off with mobile works, all the operational procedures and designing the traffic guidance scheme, so you step through all of those types of things. There's a whole suite of activities that could be used for this as well. So lastly, short-term low-impact work sites, the last part of the design side of things. These are the activities where you don't need to set up a static work site. So when I step on a road, and I do it all the time, and driving down with Ben and Annie yesterday, okay, I was sitting in the passenger seat, so I was able to photo and video stuff quite readily. When I'm by myself, I pull over, I step onto the road. Do I just walk out on the road? No. I make sure I've got the right PPE in, I make sure my vehicle's parked in the right place, I've got a portable yellow light, I plug it, put it on top, and I'll wait for the appropriate gap in traffic to walk out and do it. That's working in accordance with gaps in traffic. So there's a whole suite of clauses that were in the old Australian standard, some which had been updated and modified by road authorities, and we've captured those. Now, all of these are considered a departure from safe practices in a static work site. So you have to do a risk assessment to show that it's worthwhile doing. Many of them are worthwhile, and one of the examples I'll give is the contractors who are replacing traffic signals in Brisbane. They came and saw us and said, oh, when we have to replace the red light bulb, because sometimes they go out, when we have to replace it, the standard practice that you've told us is that we have to close off a lane each side because there's poles in the median. Because it's an intersection, we have to put signs and devices down every approach to this intersection. Seems a bit much. We're talking to them. Yeah, it takes an hour to set all this up. How long does the job take? Oh, to put the ladder up? Exactly. Put the ladder up, unlock, plug and play. You pull one out, plug one in, lock it back up, climb back down, less than 2 minutes. So an hour of setup and an hour of removal for a 2-minute job. The risk that it's introduced is actually higher than the risk it's mitigated. And that's where these short-term clauses come in. When might be the safest time to replace a bulb on a traffic light? a bit counterintuitive. When might be the safest time?
At a red light.
Sorry?
When the lights is red.
When it's red. That's for start. How about morning peak hour when all the traffic's queued up and stopped?
2 a.m. in the morning.
No, not 2 a.m. Morning peak hour. Traffic's not moving. All right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, just think about it. A lot of works, in theory, are safest when traffic's not moving. So if you have to replace a sign at the side of the road, I'm not talking about blocking lanes, okay? That's not going to happen. But if you're replacing a sign at the side of the road, rather than wait till 2 in the morning when traffic's doing 80 k's an hour and they're all drunk, maybe you're better waiting till 9 o'clock in the morning when traffic's doing 10 k's an hour and everyone's listening to the radio on the way to work. They're most alert, hopefully. Maybe it's safer then.
Time restrictions along the main road, so they won't do that.
They won't let you block a lane. There's nothing about you parking your vehicle around the corner and then walking back and fixing the sign. Okay, there's locations. Let's not get into detail. I'm not talking about every location, but just think about a lot of the locations that you got. So we talk about some of the essential principles for short-term low-impact works. The practices is divided into works on the road within a traffic lane or the works off the road outside the traffic lane. A lot of this applies for landscapers, people who are doing gardening works along a lot of our roads, utility authorities who are typically working in the verge but not on the lane, gyms mowing. If they're mowing my front yard, well, it's a workplace, isn't it? They should have some practice to protect themselves. What we've done with each of them is just draw a nice simple little diagram. So gaps in traffic, as I said, park the vehicle here, road worker's going to be here, lookout person there. There's a set of criteria that we have with each of these clauses and you have to answer yes to every single one of them. If you can't use that process. If you can answer yes, you can use it. If you can use it, we've then got a set of risk questions to answer. We've got an implementation process, how you should do it. So in this particular case, you drive to the site, you park the work vehicle on, put the light on, make sure it's safe to exit the vehicle, move around to the back or the other side of the vehicle, spotter gets in place, make sure the spotter can see far enough. Once you've done that, worker can then just step out on the road and do what they need to do in the appropriate gaps. And that's me, early part of my career, putting tubes on the road to count cars. Because that's how I did it. I waited for gaps in traffic. My work partner was standing there and they were looking out and it would scream at me if a vehicle started approaching faster than we might have expected. So, similar diagrams for all, but that same process follows for all the short-term low-impact clauses. The guide for field staff, some fundamental principles that they need to comply with. One of the important ones for me, everything shall be in place before work starts. So the implementer, and this might seem counterintuitive for some of the contractors, the implementer should be the one telling you when you can start work, not the other way around. Now there was a case in Cairns, unfortunately, where the traffic management team had put out all the traffic management, so all the cones, all the signs were all in place. And they were driving around doing their final drive-through checks to make sure that everything was in the right place. The last part of the TGS to be installed was their works vehicle to be parked at this location between traffic and the workers with the flashing arrow board on top of it on. That was the last part of the TGS. Now clearly, because they're driving around, it wasn't in place. The supervisor of the line marking team, because this is all done at night, and apparently he wanted to get home early, decided he wasn't going to wait for this vehicle to come back. He was just going to start working. And this is thermoplastic line marking, so he's in the middle of the lane, putting out the stencils and everything to start putting down the line marking. Driver lost control, went through the cones, went exactly where the works vehicle would have been to protect him. It hit him and it killed him. Now there was a lot of, I've read the coroner's report from that, and there was a lot of argy-bargy about what he wanted and that he hadn't got what he wanted. The coroner very clearly concluded, the traffic guidance scheme said work vehicle must be there, and he did not wait for it. Despite everything else, he did not wait for that part of the TGS to be in place. And that was the very clear conclusion, was that was the primary factor which led from it turning from an accident or a crash into a fatality. So, basic principles for TMI. The role of the implementer. We talk about what they can and can't do. their day-to-day activities. The document is written in the form of a day in the life of an implementer. So it's set out to very clearly go through just step to step. So first thing, before they leave the depot in the morning, what should they do? Some basic stuff. Make sure they've got all the diagrams and have details of all the sites that they're going to visit. Now again, there was a coroner's report from a crash that happened here in Tasmania back in 2013, I think it was, Ben. Coroner's report only came out last year. And there was a team that were doing maintenance works, and they visited a site which wasn't on the list of sites that the traffic management crew had for the day. So they didn't have a traffic guidance scheme for that. So they just sort of fudged together something. Unfortunately, there was a lot of things together with what they put together. The traffic controller was hit and killed. And one of the findings that came out about that was that they didn't have all of the information on site that they needed for that day. All the TGSs for every site that they were going to visit didn't have them available. So we talk about equipment and devices. They should do checks on everything. Check that they've actually got everything they need. I can't tell you how many sites I've visited where you visit it and there are things missing. We've had our inspectors go and talk to them and say, why haven't you put that sign up? It's on the diagram, why haven't you put it up? Oh, well, we didn't have enough of them on the ute. Why is there gaps in your cones? Oh, well, our standard ute carries 50 cones. Well, clearly on this job you need 70. Don't just put gaps. You should have had 70 on the ute before you left the depot. So, me as the designer, what I do is I provide an itemised list with every TGS that I prepare. These are the devices that you need, including how many cones I think you need. Just to make sure it's crystal clear to the crew getting into the truck or the ute each day, make sure you've got all of this. So that's before they even leave the depot. When they get to the site, what's the first thing they do? The first thing they typically do is get out of the truck and start pulling signs off the truck, isn't it? What they should do is get out and do a risk assessment. Is the site the same as what's drawn? Is there a line of parked cars where I was expecting there to be nothing? Is there an embankment where I'm being told to put all these signs? Is there some reason I can't do it? Only needs to be a very quick risk assessment. Should be documented to show that you've actually done it. But you do that before you, and that's an on-site safety analysis, risk assessment, a toolbox talk. Everybody who's involved should know what's going on with the site that day. You shouldn't just know your bit and stand there thinking, I have no idea what they're doing. Doesn't seem to line up with my stuff, but I don't know. Everyone should know what's going on. Then in the installation. Now the instructions for installation typically used to be, start at the start, go through to the end. Removal, reverse the order. Now that works okay for a two-lane, two-way road, but as soon as you throw in side roads, intersections, detours, where's the start? Which direction is the start? What am I going to do? I've heard of situations where a road is closed before the detour is developed. So drivers, they're closed, they're diverted off, and they just get lost. The worst scenario I ever heard of was where someone was setting up a contraflow and started at the start, diverted all the traffic across the median to the opposite side of the road before they'd shut the other side of the road down to one lane. Now, there's always, every time I tell this, there's always sniggers and how that. It happens because they started at the start. That was what was at the bottom of the plan, which looks like the start. They worked through to the finish. That was the order they were doing it. This comes back to the experience. You may not know the experience of the person installing it. So we've developed guidance which gives you, I guess, expanded on that. That you do side streets first. Side streets and detours get done first. So before you do anything on the road that's being worked on, do anything you need to do on a side street and put all the detours in place. Then you install the devices in the non-working lane direction. So in this case, you install those ones. Then finally, you install everything in the working lane direction. Now we had a consultant who was a specialist traffic management company preparing this, who did this every day, and this was based on industry best practice. This is not me as a designer telling you what to do. This is industry saying this is the best practice. And there's half a dozen diagrams on this for various scenarios about how to set up the site. Instructions on operation and maintenance, instructions on the removal. Another set of diagrams on the best order to remove a site. Okay, traffic controllers. Look, none of this has changed massively from what you've seen before. The way you want traffic controllers working, it is pretty much the same. The big difference is there's a lot of information up front about portable traffic control devices, how they should be set out, how they should be laid out, how they should be operated, where the traffic controller should stand, which is not leaning against the trailer. It's 3 or 4 metres away up the road. If they're supervising trainees, the requirements for that, because you want new traffic controllers, ultimately we want them trained on site and observed and watched before they're let loose on live traffic. Medical fitness. They have to be able to stand for several hours at a time. They have to be able to react quickly and run down an escape route if they need to. Now that rules out me, I've got a stuffed hip. I'm not running. I can't be a traffic controller. They need to have good enough eyesight such that if their radio battery fails and they're standing there with a stop-slow bat, that they can see the other one 200 metres away and work out which side is facing them. They don't need to read it, but is it yellow or red? So that until 10 minutes later when someone can come and fix my radio, I can see and still coordinate traffic rather than having traffic going head-on at each other. Some basic medical requirements. What's also been introduced in there is a, character test as well, and that's based on practices in Queensland, which other states have said are a good idea. Reason being, there's only 2 occupations in this country who can stop you on a road at 2 a.m. in the morning. The first is the police. Hopefully they've been vetted and are competent in doing their job legitimately. The second are traffic controllers. And the reason they did that in Queensland, we used to have a particular problem with bikies, and they all love the security industry and they all love the traffic control industry. So you had outlaw bicycle gangs controlling traffic and stopping anyone at 2 a.m. in the morning anywhere. So we've said, no, you have to have, there's certain criminal sentences that if you don't pass this test, you will not be a traffic controller. And the other states and territories have said, yeah, it's a pretty good idea. So if someone has been convicted of a serious assault, those sorts of charges, can't be traffic controllers. Responsibilities of a traffic controller, what to wear and use, their equipment, what to do when they arrive at the site, how to control traffic. As I said, none of this has changed massively other than we've added in all the portable traffic control devices. We've put in a fair bit about what to do when things don't go to plan as well, because it does happen. And I'm sure any of you can tell me about traffic controllers who have had things thrown at them, abuse thrown at them, spat at. There's one traffic controller in Queensland who can tell you about how his ute was shot as they drove past. It happens. So, but they also get vehicles just scorching through past their traffic control station. And do they go, hey, they should have stopped? No. What should they do? Surely they need to have instructions. Any vehicle that passes you on a stop bat, you will do this. Get on the radio. Who do you tell? You've got to inform someone. And even if that someone has told you, here's a foghorn and just pull that, do whatever. You should have instructions of what to do if a vehicle doesn't obey you. Processes and procedures, just skip quickly through these. Road categories have been adopted. These come out of New Zealand. Industry has told us very clearly new entrants should not be on motorways or high-speed, high-volume roads. They should start on a residential cul-de-sac with no traffic. So we've got category 1, which is your lower speed, lower volume. Category 2, which is the rest, except for your motorways, which are category 3. Obviously, in terms of the training, this won't be in for some time, but it's just something for you to start thinking about. And also, I guess, good practice for those of you who run traffic management companies about where should you start new people until you understand how competent they are. And those figures are from New Zealand, but just show the categories as they apply there. Traffic guidance schemes, we talk quite a bit about generic. You can use generic TGSs, but they must be assessed in detail. I've got an entire workshop that I've developed on how to develop generic TGSs and how to develop the processes that go with them. For something as simple as patching a small repair on a road, I've got a bundle of 54 TGSs I developed. And that might seem excessive, but I've done every speed limit from 110 down to 40. And why have I done that? because the distances between signs and the number of signs you need vary for each of those speeds. And hence I've got a separate TGS for each one, clearly stepping through what needs to be done. I've also then developed a very clear process with a series of yes, no type answers where you come down to, hopefully, where if I gave you the package, nearly all of you would pick exactly the same diagram that I would have picked. That's a robust process. If I give you a process and I get 54 different choices from this side of the room, where's the failure? It's with me, isn't it? If I give the same group of people the same set of diagrams and everyone picks the same one except for Annie at the back, sorry Annie, where's the problem? With Annie. So, it's what I want you to think about with generics. We have got processes in there, they can be used. Understand how to do that, and as I said, there's other workshops that I've got, and that is a whole other workshop on developing them for your use. Training framework, look, it's documented there, it's not going to be in place for a while, it's a FYI for the moment. Roles and responsibilities for everybody who's out there, and this is an important one for everyone to understand. What are your roles and responsibilities? And understand how it impacts how you do your job. And standard forms and model contract specs, that's mainly for agencies putting out contracts. It'd be great if everyone used the same forms because I think that'd make it easiest for everyone in the industry to do the same thing. Sample layouts, I'll flick through this one quickly, but the intent of these, in many states there used to be a bundle of drawings, and quite frankly, people would pull one out and say, I'll have one of those things. And just copy it, and that's what they put on site. No assessment as to whether it was suitable or not, and I can tell you some horror stories in that respect as well. These drawings are not meant for use on site. These are drawings to assist a designer in putting together a traffic management plan and traffic guidance scheme. That's their intent. So it's for me as a designer, I've stepped through part 3 and I've worked out all of these devices and I think I know the right order. Well, these diagrams will just add as some confirmation for me that I'm doing what is roughly intended. So in here, there's the structure, and you can see there's no actual sign faces on these. So no one can pick them up and use them. They're done on real-life backgrounds, which have been generalised, just to, again, show you real-life types of situations. References to other parts of the guide are in black, so you can see which parts to go to relevant to this. Key risks that you need to consider in red. Designer considerations, so key things that I as the designer need to consider are in blue. And key implementation considerations, again, that I need to consider as a designer are in green. And it's outlined for those scenarios. Just to give you an example, it's for the designer to flick through those and see the sorts of issues. And there's an example of a sample layout. There's also a case study in there which deals with a project. And it starts off with, if I was to visit the site and make notes, this is how I do it. Now these might be just handwritten notes. But I should keep that as part of my planning process. This is me identifying all the key risks, including some of these businesses around here or school zones or shopping centre or whatever. That's me identifying and just keeping a record of all my notes of what was at a site. I then develop up the staging plan, and you saw one of these when I talked about part 2. For this job, there's 3 separate, totally separate stages. These were the 3 staging plans. I then develop up the traffic guidance schemes, and this is when I get into the signs and devices. And there's 4 of them shown here, but there might be 8, there might be 20. There should be any number of diagrams needed. Lastly, part 10, risk management. Basically, we just follow the Australian standard, the international standard for risk management. And the international standard, it's quite general. We've customised it to really talk about temporary traffic management. So it's put in terms of what it means for temporary traffic management. We follow the same steps. So the first step is to determine the site risk rating. And that's based on the categories of roads, which I showed you in the previous part, how far your workers are from traffic and what the speed of traffic is. That's just a very basic first step. What's the risk at this site? We're not considering pedestrians and cyclists and everything, just the risk to your workers. Based on that, you get an initial level of planning that you believe that you need to undertake. You should then go through and consider any site-specific risks. And what the guide says is that any of them come out as high or very high, you might need to go back up and do a higher level of planning. Don't just try and tack on ways to address them. Think, maybe I need to replan this job, re-rate it as high and do a more detailed level of planning. The easiest way to deal with a risk, it's not on site, it's not in the detailed design, it's at the planning phase. That's when you can have the most change to what you need to do. You saw this before. This is the standard risk controls diagram. You want to eliminate the hazard first before you move into substitute or isolation or engineering, which is through and past, before you move to least preferred, which is your short-term low impact. Reviews, inspection and road safety audits, all I'll say here is they are all different. A compliance inspection simply tells us, has the installer put it in accordance with the TGS? A road safety audit will look and say, yes, it's installed correctly, but I've still got these safety concerns. Totally different task, totally different issue. So this talks about the different types, what they mean, how and when they should be undertaken. Events is a fairly hot topic. Traffic management at events, the basic principle is the same principles you follow for roadworks, you should follow for events as well. Now, I've been asked a lot of questions about this because quite simply, it becomes very expensive then for a small event to set up temporary traffic management. And there are practices described in here about event-specific signs and some of the relaxations that some road authorities allow in this space as well. And lastly, emergency works. This is not much change from what was in the Australian standard previously, except we've put in a definition of what was an emergency because a lot of people were misusing this clause because it used to be called emergency and unplanned works. I keep left signs knocked over. Oh, it's unplanned. I'll use this, which means I don't need any traffic management at all. Absolute rubbish. It may be unplanned, but it's certainly not an emergency. So the definition has come down to emergency only. The definition on what an emergency is has come from Vic Roads, so they had a very clear definition of this. And we've also said where this clause applies and where it doesn't apply. And regular maintenance activities like sign repairs, street light repairs, traffic signal repairs do not fit into the category of emergency works. At a traffic signal, if a vehicle is knocked down a pole and you've got live power, yes, that's an emergency. But once the power is made safe, once the equipment has been pulled off the road, it ceases being an emergency and it becomes an activity that you can plan for. That's where you often see someone will come back 2 days later and actually replace the pole. Diagrams are much the same. They're a little bit tweaked on what was in there before. So what does this all mean for you and where to from here? Just firstly, some of the context. A lot of people have told me up front, oh, we should get the police to enforce more. That'll fix it, won't it? All these drivers, they're all at fault. Let's just get the police to hammer them. Or let's educate the public. Let's make sure they all know. And all commendation to TMAA for the campaigns. But the approach that we've taken is very much along the lines that when I've got 95% non-compliant sites, it's pretty hard to get those messages across when the police will not come to your site and enforce when it's wrong. They can't. So it's useless asking for police enforcement when the speed limits at your site are wrong. They've been left out inappropriately, etc., etc. Also, how do I educate drivers to do certain things? When we tell them, if you see the worker symbolic sign, there are workers there and you must slow down. Now, who can put their hand on their heart and say, those signs are only ever used when workers are on site? Because I see them left out 24/7, all over the place. So, the approach we've taken, let's clean up our own backyard, let's get temporary traffic management right on the ground first. Once we've got it right, we can start hammering the education, we can start hammering the enforcement. This guide will not be the panacea to all the problems. I really want to make that clear, is that this is not going to fix everything. We want to get this right. Once we've done that, we need to talk about enforcement, we need to talk about driver behaviour, we need to talk about some of the constraints that road authorities put on you, which say you must keep all this traffic open at all times, which basically means you've got no option except to put traffic right next to the workers. You need to look at some of the contractor pressures, and my apologies to any contractors in the room, but I've actually heard stories where contractors tender for a job, a quantity surveyor sits in the office and says, I reckon traffic management will be 3% of the value of this job. They win it, they then go to call sub-consultants to contract to come in and tender for it. They then go, righto, well, you were cheapest, you've got the job, by the way, knock 20% off your price, or we'll go to the next person and ask them to drop. When you look at all that process, how does that drive safety? When you've picked the lowest tenderer at the lowest possible price, driven them down further. So there's some pressures that need to come back onto contractors to think of safety, and many of them are doing a very good job now in considering this. So how should you respond to all this? Become familiar with the documents. Don't be scared. You don't have to enact it all tomorrow. This session is not the click where you say, now do everything. Become familiar with it. Start to learn what's in there. It's an opportunity to throw it open to your staff, start opening them up. As I said before, pull them apart and do what you can do them. Understand some of the emerging needs in terms of generics. The government needs to look at transition time frames, and Ben was discussing that before. And lastly, some of the training that I've been heavily involved in already delivering, particularly in Queensland, because I think Queensland is the most advanced. I've already taken a number of road authorities through the road categorisation exercise, workshopping with them, developing up their road categories so that they're entirely comfortable with what's coming. I've also developed a workshop around generics. That whole process that I spoke to you about, developing up the 54 diagrams that I did, there's a whole process to take any organisation through that. Some of the telecommunications authorities are very keen for me to do that with them, but I've said I can't until all the state road authorities have signed up to the new guide, because at the moment you have to comply with their requirements, so there's not much point right now. Awareness training on a whole range of different topics like today, design coaching and support, peer review. One of the important ones that's really come to light recently is the role of the contractor or local government and the traffic management company in temporary traffic management. This is for purchases of temporary traffic management. This is about understanding what does a purchaser need to be aware of. Unfortunately, we still hear the stories where the contractor says, well, I've subbied it out to them, it's all their problem, not my responsibility. Now, work health and safety legislation will very clearly tell you, you cannot say that, it's still your problem. So as a purchaser of it, what are your responsibilities? So look, there's a whole stack of material that's coming. There's a whole stack of material that's already been developed to help support you through this process if that's the way you wish to go.